On May 22nd, 1980, around 9 a.m., a housekeeper named Eleanor at the Quality Inn Hotel in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey, was making her usual rounds checking the rooms when she heard screams coming from room 117. Inside, 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell had been enduring hours of torture at the hands of one of New York and New Jersey's most prolific serial killers. The quick actions of the hotel staff at the Quality Inn likely saved the life of not only Leslie, but countless other future potential victims. I'm Amanda Morgan, and you're listening to New York's Dark Side. Hey everyone, it's been a bit, but I am back. Between the holidays, some personal stuff, cancer diagnosis, and subsequent surgery for one of my beloved fur children, my dog Harley. It has been a rough couple of months, but I'm excited to get back to the grind and bring you more true crime, dark history, and all the stuff I know I've been missing diving into over the last few months. Even though I haven't released anything during this time, I have been working on episodes in the background. I've got several in production or done with production now that I'll be releasing over the next couple of weeks. I'll save updates about the show to the end and get started with the case we're covering today. I'm starting this relaunch, so to speak, off with a bang and bringing you an extremely dark story over the next couple of weeks. That's right, this is a multi-part deep dive. In this group of episodes, I'm covering Richard Cottingham, a prolific serial killer who claims to have had between 80 and 100 victims. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is going to be dark. I had to step away from researching this a couple of times for my own mental health. I'm going to give a trigger warning now. This case discusses elements of sexual assault, torture, his key signature, which is dark, and the murder of young women, some in their early teens. In the second part of this series, there's also a discussion of attempted suicide. As always, all of my sources are listed in the show notes and on the webpage for this episode at www.nydarksidepodcast.com. I've also included some resources that are available for anyone that has been a victim of human trafficking or sexual assault that I'll discuss a little further at the end. But for now, let's dive right into it. Leslie Ann Odell arrived in New York City at the Port Authority Terminal via a Greyhound bus from Washington State around dawn on May 18, 1980. She was young, blonde, beautiful, and looking to start a new life, but arriving alone without any money left her sitting on a bench at the bus terminal, feeling some regret about her decision. She was approached by a man who introduced himself to her as Jimmy, and after chatting for a while, he invited her to have breakfast with him. He seemed friendly and understanding, so she accepted, and they continued to get to know each other over breakfast. Jimmy would offer to take her to his father's house in New Jersey. What Leslie didn't know then was that Jimmy was a recruiter for the sex trade, and that night she was given the opportunity to, quote, try out for a new career in sex work. She would spend the next few nights passed around to another pimp, working different streets around Manhattan, and terrified of the situation that she had found herself in. On the night of May 21st, she was approached by a man in a blue and silver Chevy Caprice, where she was assigned that night on the corner of Lexington Avenue and 25th Street. The man introduced himself as Tommy, and he asked her to join him for a drink, which she accepted. Over drinks, he built her trust, talking to her about his house, his job, and a couple of girlfriends that he had. He offered to help her get out of New York City and take her to a bus depot in New Jersey so she could start over again. Deciding that she didn't have much to lose, she opted to take a chance and trust him. accepting his offer. After leaving the bar, Tommy took her to a 24-hour diner called New Star, where he bought her a steak, French fries, and a Coke, and they talked some more. He brought up the topic of purchasing sex from her, and they negotiated a price. Leslie thought that the money that she earned would help her in her plans to start over once she got to the bus depot. After they finished eating, he drove her to the Quality Inn Hotel in Hasbrouck Heights. It was early in the morning when they arrived, just starting to get light out as they checked in, and Tommy paid the bill for room 117. Once they got inside, Leslie went into the bathroom to freshen up a bit, and Tommy stepped outside of the room, telling her that he wanted to move his car around to the other side of the building. He came back carrying both a paper bag and a duffel bag. They climbed into bed together, and this is when Leslie's nightmare would begin. The man claiming to be Tommy offered her a massage, which she accepted. She rolled onto her stomach, and he straddled her, pinning her to the bed. But instead of giving her a massage, she felt something sharp against her neck and could hear the sound of something jingling behind her. Before she knew it, she was handcuffed and defenseless. In Rod Leith's book, The Prostitute Murders, he goes into great detail of the incredible torture that Leslie would suffer at the hands of the man pretending to be Tommy. While I'm not going to go into that amount of depth, this is your cue to skip ahead about 15 seconds or so if you would like. Over the next few hours, Leslie suffered incredible trauma as she was beaten with the man's belt, cut repeatedly with a knife, raped, and sodomized. Tommy threatened to shoot her with a pistol he pulled out of one of the bags that he had retrieved earlier, forced her to perform oral sex on him, and savagely bit her breast to the point where he almost severed her nipple. Leslie, however, though I'm sure she was petrified, was not ready to give up without a fight. At one point, he removed her leather gag, ordering her to give him a bath with her tongue. This was her chance. She was able to grab the pistol that Tommy had threatened her with from where it had ended up under the bed, and she pulled it out, taking aim at him. She told him not to move or she would shoot. What she didn't know was that the gun was a fake. Tommy was unfazed at her attempt to threaten him, picked up the knife that he had been brutalizing her with, and began to advance towards her. Desperate, Leslie pulled the trigger of the gun she still had aimed at his chest. To her dismay, nothing happened. It was then that Leslie, still free from the gag, began to scream. Thankfully for Leslie, a housekeeper for the hotel named Eleanor was at this time making her rounds and heard Leslie's panicked screams. Eleanor did not hesitate to act because Eleanor was terrified, as were many of the other staff working at the hotel. A few weeks earlier, while cleaning room 132, Mary, another maid for the same Quality Inn, had found the naked and handcuffed body of a young woman stuffed under one of the room's double beds. That murder was still unsolved. Eleanor quickly alerted the front desk to the screams, and within moments they were on the phone with room 117. The hotel's assistant manager, Todd, had called into the room and was speaking on the phone with Leslie. He told her that they had heard screams coming from her room and wanted to know if everything was okay. Leslie told him everything was fine, but Todd thankfully was not convinced by the tone of her voice and told her that he would be coming to the room. Inside the room, the man she knew as Tommy was in a panicked rage and struck her, sending her tumbling across the room. Before he could do anything more, though, Todd, the assistant manager, and Paula, the hotel's head housekeeper, were outside the door knocking and asking to see Leslie. Leslie was still naked. Tommy told her to answer the door, but to leave the chain lock engaged so they could not see all the way inside. Tommy stood behind her with the knife pressed against her back as she spoke through the small gap. They asked her to open the door all the way, but she told them that she couldn't because she was not dressed. With a trembling voice, she told them that everything was fine and that she had just gotten into a fight with her boyfriend. Desperately, though, Leslie was signaling to them as best she could with her eyes and her hand to let them know that Tommy was behind her like a true badass warrior. After they left, Tommy made her call the front desk, where Leslie again spoke with Todd, trying to reassure him as best she could that everything was okay. but I'm sure her mind was screaming to him that it wasn't. Todd and Paula were not at all convinced that Leslie was okay, and they called police. When Leslie got off the phone, Tommy asked her if they were coming. Leslie said the only thing she could think of now, yes, they are coming, before collapsing on the bed. Tommy decided now was the ideal time to flee, grabbing all of his shit and running out the door. The hotel staff was not about to let this man escape. They were attentively watching the room, knowing the police were on their way. Patrolman Stanley Melowick was the first to arrive and was waved down by Todd, the hotel's assistant manager. When the man claiming to be Tommy ran from the room, another hotel maid named Jean saw him, which caused him to alter his original course. Leslie emerged from the room, screaming for them to stop him because he tried to kill her. Patrolman Melowick checked his shotgun and got out of his car. He could hear someone approaching him. A moment later, a man carrying a couple bags and what appeared to be a small caliber pistol raced into view. Melowick shouted at him to stop, raising his shotgun. After taking a few more steps, the man did stop and stood spread eagle against the hotel's wall. Melowick quickly disarmed him and put him in handcuffs, and as he did so, the man told him that he, quote, hadn't done anything, unquote, and had, quote, been with a hooker and gotten scared, end quote. Meanwhile, in room 117, Leslie was in absolute hysterics when Sergeant Edward Shermack arrived to meet with her. She was covered with a sheet, and one of the hotel's maids was trying to comfort her. Leslie was still handcuffed, and Sergeant Shermack did attempt to release her with his own handcuff keys, but they wouldn't work. Upon search of the man they had apprehended fleeing from her room, they would find a set of keys to the pair of handcuffs on her wrists in his duffel bag. Leslie was able to identify the Chevy Caprice that the man had brought her to the hotel in before being sent to an area hospital to be treated for her injuries. At the hotel, while looking into the man's bags, police found more handcuffs, adhesive tape, a leather gag, collars used in S&M, a switchblade, 2 replica pistols, and a stockpile of prescription pills including Valium and barbiturates. The man, when questioned, said everything that happened between him and Leslie had been consensual, and that he had paid her $180 for sex, and she agreed when they made the arrangement to let him do anything he wanted. The police were not buying it at all, and he was taken to Hasbrouck Heights Police Department. As you may have gathered, the man's name was not Tommy. He would be identified as 33-year-old Richard Cottingham, who lived with his wife Janet and their 3 children in Lodi, New Jersey. Yes, like many other serial killers, Dennis Rader, Gary Ridgway, and Joseph D'Angelo, for example, Richard Cottingham was living the life of a normal, everyday husband and father, and no one suspected him of any wrongdoing, let alone being a serial killer. At home, things were not all sunshine and rainbows, though. Cottingham would tell investigators that things had gotten a little rough with Leslie because he was really broken up about the fact that his wife Janet had filed for divorce, and that was causing him a great deal of stress. Janet had in fact filed for divorce in April of 1980, citing extreme cruelty. She would file in her motion for divorce that the family was often left without money for essentials, that Richard was gone from the home for prolonged periods of time most nights, that he was frequently visiting gay bars and bathhouses around Manhattan, or going to Plato's Retreat, which was a swingers club, which on their own, these activities, aside from depriving your family from necessities, are not terrible things, right? Many couples with perfectly healthy marriages participate in open relationships and swinging. As long as there's open communication and everyone is on board with the arrangement, then you do you. Richard was, however, living a sick, deplorable double life. On the outside to his neighbors, he seemed like a kind, caring, though somewhat odd father. Inside, he was the epitome of evil. In that motion for divorce, Janet had cited that Richard had refused to have sex with her after the birth of their youngest child. He told investigators that the day that he met Leslie in Manhattan, he had found out the divorce hearing had been postponed. So he decided that he wanted to go see a movie. He couldn't remember where he went or what he saw, so that sounds legit. He then decided to go to a restaurant to eat, but again, he couldn't recall where he went to eat or what he had. Then he went to a couple of bars, and at one of the bars, he claimed Leslie approached him soliciting sex. He admitted to taking her to a couple more places before they finally arrived at the Quality Inn Hotel, where he registered the room under the name Tommy Carruthers. At this point, he began to refer to Leslie as the female subject instead of her name. He told police that he had never threatened her. She had agreed to everything that he did to her, and that he had handcuffed her at her request for her own sexual pleasure, and that he had put ankle cuffs on her to keep her from running away in case she got panicky. Which, again, you do you. Lots of people probably use handcuffs in intimate situations, but I feel like this kind of contradicts his statements, because if she was agreeing to everything, why would she run away? Anyway, not the point. At this point, Richard Cottingham requested a lawyer. I mentioned earlier that the hotel staff at the Quality Inn had been on edge due to a recent unsolved murder in another room of the same hotel a couple weeks before. Investigators interrogating Richard Cottingham were aware of that case as well, in addition to one other unsolved murder from 1977, where a woman's body had been found discarded in the parking lot of the Quality Inn Hotel. They began taking a much harder look at Richard Cottingham. So let's back up and talk about his early life. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25th, 1946, in the Bronx, New York. His early life was really, for the most part, uneventful. He wasn't abused. He didn't come from a broken home. He doesn't have any of the red flag items that you hear about with others that grow up to become so evil. There's no history of animal cruelty, no trouble with the law in his youth and adolescence. His father, William, worked in insurance at Metropolitan Life. His mother, Anna, was a homemaker. Richard was the oldest of three with two younger sisters. As a young child, Richard was described as somewhat odd, and he had some trouble making friends, which, same. But other than that, nothing really red flag with him. When he was 12, his family moved to Rivervale, New Jersey in Bergen County to a large split-level home on Cleveland Avenue. He attended St. Andrews and started raising pigeons as a hobby. Later, when he started at Pascack Valley High School, he had a bit of an easier time making friends, though classmates would later report when news broke of his arrest that he often spoke about women in a very negative manner. He was a member of the cross-country and track team during high school. Richard Cottingham would graduate from high school in 1964, and he started working as a computer operator at the same insurance company as his father, Metropolitan Life. He took several computer classes while working there to increase his skills, and after 2 years, he found a job with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Greater New York, where he worked in the center of the business district in Midtown Manhattan, working evening shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. On a side note, for a period of time, Richard Cottingham worked in the office with a man named Rodney Alcala, who was using the alias John Berger. Alcala was a fugitive child molester and serial killer who had come to Manhattan to hide out after beating and sexually assaulting an 8-year-old girl that he had lured into his car and then taken to his apartment on her way to school. Both men would later claim to not have been aware of each other and their outside of work activities when they were questioned. The girl that Alcala had abducted was thankfully found alive, but she spent 32 days in a coma and months more in rehab after the incident. Like, fucked up. And I feel so bad for their coworkers as well. Like, I can't imagine finding out later that I was working with one sick, twisted serial killer, let alone two. What's the statistic that they throw around that over the course of your lifetime, the average person walks past 36 murderers? Fucking scary. And I think about that a lot, actually, because a few years ago, my family and I were out west doing our road trip, and we went to Arches National Park around the same time that Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie were there. And I wonder sometimes if we happened to pass by each other, because it was literally the same group of days that they were out there, we were there. Fucking scary. Anyway, back to Cottingham. So while things were seemingly going well at work, Richard did have some legal trouble in 1969 and into the early 1970s. On October 3rd, 1969, Cottingham nearly mowed down an entire sidewalk full of people in Manhattan and was arrested for drunk driving. He would spend 10 days in jail and received a $50 fine. On May 3rd, 1970, Richard would marry his wife Janet at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Queens, New York, and they would move to a small apartment at Ledgewood Terrace in Little Ferry, New Jersey. He continued to commute to his job at Blue Cross Blue Shield in New York. Throughout their marriage, Richard would have many, many affairs, later bragging to investigators that he was cheating on Janet during their honeymoon. Fucking dick. This guy is a real asshole. On August 21st, 1972, Cottingham was arrested after being caught shoplifting at a Stearns department store in New Jersey. On September 4th, 1973, he was arrested again, this time for robbery, assault, and sodomy charges. Unfortunately, these charges would end up being dropped because the victim was a sex worker, and both she and her pimp had come forward to file the charges against Richard. However, neither of them came to the court proceedings, so they had to drop them. Despite these charges, Janet stayed by Cottingham's side, and on October 15th, 1973, just a few weeks later, Richard and Janet welcomed their first son, Blair. On March 12, 1974, Richard was arrested again for unlawful imprisonment and robbery of another sex worker. Once again, these charges would be dropped because the sex worker didn't come to the proceedings. Richard and Janet would move their family to a 3-bedroom home in Lodi, New Jersey in 1975. They welcomed their second son, Scott, on March 28, 1975, and their daughter, Jenny, the following year on October 13, 1976. It was after Jenny was born that Richard told Janet that they would no longer be having sex. Soon after this, he started an affair with a woman that would become a long-term girlfriend named Barbara Lucas. At work, Cottingham appeared to be doing well. His bosses would describe him as one of their most experienced and productive computer operators. To his coworkers, he had a habit of running his mouth. He would brag about all his vices outside of work, his hiring of sex workers, gambling, participating in S&M. He would talk about how he lured sex workers from Manhattan to New Jersey by showing them huge wads of cash consisting of thousands of dollars. But he wouldn't give his family money for essentials. Okay. They had no idea what Richard Cottingham was truly getting into outside of work, and that they were working with a dangerous serial killer, who we now know has murdered at least 18 women between New York and New Jersey, but claims to have murdered as many as 80 or 100 total, and may be connected to unsolved murders in other states, including Florida, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. We'll likely never know the true extent of the horror and torture that he committed upon his victims, and he's seriously just fine with that. He's not been the most forthcoming with information. I've put his picture on social media, but if you haven't seen it, when you first look at pictures of him from the last few years, he looks like he could be sitting in your local department store as Santa, a really fucked up evil Santa. Back in the early 1960s, he wasn't that bad looking of a man. On the website, I've posted his senior yearbook photo. If he is to be believed, he likely committed his first murder right around then. As of 2024, he's now 77 years old and likely nearing the end of his natural life in a New Jersey state prison. After his arrest on May 22, 1980, And during the subsequent investigation and court proceedings, we would start to learn the true darkness and depravity of Mr. Cottingham. It's important to understand that at the time all of this was going on, New York City's Times Square was a much different place than it is now. In the late 1960s and 70s, it was a place of high crime, sex trafficking, drug use, and violence. Almost all of the subway systems go through Times Square. The Port Authority bus terminal brings in people visiting New York from all over. Anthony Bianco, an author who wrote the book Ghosts of 42nd Street, would say of Times Square, quote, 42nd Street was like a collecting point for all sorts of people. It was like a drain. Everything came there, end quote. During this time, there was an upwards of 1,200 sex workers a night out on the streets turning tricks. The sexual culture of 42nd Street was led by a man named Martin Hodes. In the 1960s, Hodes started building private viewing booths for peep shows. This continued to grow into live peep shows, swingers clubs, massage parlors, and more. Along with the increase in these establishments came increases in drug use and trafficking, mob activity, and violence, particularly against women. Unfortunately, police would often look away in instances of crime against sex workers. They even adopted an unofficial acronym, NHI, when creating reports on sex workers found deceased, which stood for No Human Involved in the Deaths during the 1970s and 80s, meaning that no investigation would be conducted. How many of these women could have been victims of Richard Cottingham or other violent offenders in this time frame? It's fucking disgusting. These are people. Richard Cottingham had no shortage of potential victims, and he took full advantage of it. It didn't help that there were deep financial problems for the city, leading to 5,000 first responders being laid off, causing a surge in more crime. It got so bad that in the mid-1970s, the Council for Public Safety released a pamphlet called Welcome to Fear City, a survival guide for visitors of the city of New York, complete with an image of a hooded skull to try to discourage tourists from coming to the city. I've linked an article in the show notes where you can go see a copy of the pamphlet. Mayor Abe Beame would eventually form the Office of Midtown Enforcement to help curb the crime and start the cleanup of more than 450 illicit establishments that had become the center of Times Square. Not long after Cottingham's arrest in late May of 1980, as part of their investigation, police of course searched Cottingham's home. They would quickly find that Richard had a secret trophy room, a room in the basement that he kept locked that no one was allowed to enter. Inside, they would find women's clothing items, jewelry, purses, perfume. There were books highlighting torture porn and bondage. There were motel keys, and some items that would be connected to unsolved cases in Bergen County, New Jersey, connected to the Quality Inn Hotel. One of those was a small koala bear that belonged to Valerie Street, the victim from room 132 that occurred a few weeks earlier, and the key to the exterior door of the apartment complex from an unsolved homicide victim who was found in the Quality Inn parking lot in 1977. On December 15, 1977, 26-year-old Mary Ann Carr went missing from her home at Ledgewood Terrace Apartments. Mary Ann was a beautiful brunette who was said to have a striking smile. She had been a cheerleader in high school, and after graduation, she studied to become a radiology technician. And I want to make a quick note here in case you go to do your own digging into this case, that some of the source material, like a lot of the source material, they bounce between referring to Mary Ann as an X-ray technician and as a nurse. I saw this consistently across multiple sources in newspaper articles, in books, and some of the docuseries that I have referenced. As a nurse by trade, I can honestly say I cannot do the same things my friends in diagnostic imaging do. They're completely different skill sets. So shout out to all of you guys, because we need our X-ray tech friends to do what they do so that we nurses can do what we do. Anyway, the point I am trying to get at is that investigators keep discussing Marianne wearing a nurse's uniform, and they literally refer to her as a nurse when she was found. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess she was probably wearing scrubs. And why this is relevant, I have a theory that her work uniform may have played a factor in why she was chosen by Richard Cottingham that I'll get to a bit later in part 2. But Marianne dated a variety of men, from cops to doctors, and she had been married once previously. She married her second husband, Michael Carr, about a year prior to her disappearance. Michael had to take a business trip to Rochester, New York, and was going to be gone about a week. While he was gone, his mother, Catherine, had agreed to help keep Marianne company. Marianne spent the night of December 14th at Catherine's house in Hackensack. On December 15th, she got up, she went to work in Englewood, where she put in a full day. She got done at almost 7 p.m. and had plans that night to go back to her mother-in-law's house. But before going there, she drove to Ledgewood Terrace Apartments in Little Ferry, New Jersey, where she lived with Michael in apartment 112. A neighbor would later report that sometime between 7:30 and 7:40 p.m., as he was getting into his car to go to his night classes, he saw Marianne standing outside of her car talking to a man that he had assumed at the time was Michael. He didn't think there was anything odd about this interaction. He just thought they were having a conversation. No one seemed to be in any distress. He glanced at them one more time while he was pulling out of his parking space and drove away. This was the last time that Marianne was seen alive. Marianne would enter her apartment and she made herself a drink. She lit a cigarette. Sometime after 7:30 p.m., the neighbor across the hall would hear a woman scream. Knowing that some of the tenants in the building were having marital problems, this neighbor would later report that when she heard that, she just stood near her front door. She didn't know what to do when she heard this. Around 8 p.m., Catherine would try to reach Marianne by phone, but got no response. After not being able to get in touch with her for over 3 hours, Catherine called her nephew Robert, who lived in another building in the same apartment complex. He agreed to go check to see if Marianne was home, and would later tell investigators that he was able to use his building's exterior door key to get into her building's exterior door. After knocking on her apartment door and not getting an answer, Robert tried the handle and the door was unlocked, so he let himself in. He would find Marianne's half-finished drink and cigarette, but no other signs of where she could be. He called his Aunt Catherine back, and they agreed that they would reach out to Michael, who was still in Rochester, as well as to Little Ferry police. While police did respond to the apartment, there was little that they could do because they couldn't find anything to indicate something happened to Marianne. She's an adult. She can literally do whatever she wants. There's no sign of an attack, nothing. The only thing that they noticed was one of the couches was slightly out of place. But I don't think I always put my couch back when I vacuum underneath it in the exact same spot, even though I try. So sometime in the early morning hours, a police officer would note seeing a orange-red colored Camaro, Marianne's car, in front of building 470 at Ledgewood Terrace. Marianne lived in building 462, which, looking at Google Maps, it doesn't look like there's a huge distance between them to walk, but I'm wondering if they had assigned parking spots like some apartment complexes do, and if so, hers would likely be in front of her building, not in front of another building. This mystery about the parking of her car is potentially relevant because Richard Cottingham used to live in building 470 with Janet before they moved to their current home in Lodi 2 years prior. Marianne's body was found later that day on December 16th between the curb and chain link fence in the parking lot of the Quality Inn Motel. She had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles and a mark around her neck. The left leg of her pants had been cut as well, and so had a bunch of her hair. Her shoes, coat, and purse were all missing. There was tape residue around her mouth, but there was no signs of sexual assault. After Mary Ann's death, police began to find victims of sexual assault in this area, either along the side of the road or in motel rooms. Some of these women, not all, were sex workers. They all had a similar signature. They had all been tortured in a similar manner, but their attacker had not been identified. Additionally, there had been several unsolved homicides in the time between Mary Ann Carr's death and the arrest of Richard Cottingham. One of those, as I mentioned, was Valerie Street. Valerie was a 19-year-old sex worker who had arrived in New York City earlier in May of 1980 from Florida. She had been arrested on April 15th in Miami on a prostitution charge, and she was on the run. She found a room at the Hotel Seville with another sex worker named Teresa, and they became friends. Early in the morning on May 4th, Valerie was seen working the streets, dressed in a white blouse, jeans, and white tennis shoes off Madison Avenue. Around 3 a.m., using the name Shelley Dudley, she booked room 132 at the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights. She wasn't seen by workers of the hotel after that until her body was found by the maid cleaning the room the following day. The maid had noticed that one of the beds in the room appeared to not have been slept in, but that the bed coverings had been moved slightly. While vacuuming under the bed, she felt the vacuum hit something. When she went to look, she found Valerie's dead body lying handcuffed under the bed, a strip of white adhesive tape over her mouth. Valerie had bruises over most of her torso and had endured tremendous amount of torture before her life had been taken from her. Her autopsy would reveal that she had eaten a short time before her death. She had also consumed a large amount of alcohol and had been drugged. Trigger warning here, her autopsy would show signs of both sexual assault and sodomy. Her breasts had been badly bitten to the point where one of her nipples was almost removed. Investigators would find that all of her personal belongings had been removed from the room. The bedding from the one bed had been removed and was saturated with water, and there was no physical evidence of the killer initially found. They did send the handcuffs that had been around Valerie's wrists off for testing and were able to pull a thumbprint. This print would later be matched to Richard Cottingham. This asshole likely celebrated his 10th wedding anniversary by himself instead of with Janet, which, granted, they are in the process of divorcing, but if he's really broken up about his fucking marriage ending, don't you think you'd spend your time trying to get back with your wife, especially on your anniversary? Instead, he spent his time alone, trolling for victims late in the night on May 3rd, met up with Valerie, wined, dined, and drugged her, then tortured and killed her. He's a sick fuck. It would take investigators quite some time to gather information about Valerie, since at first they only had her alias and an address in Florida to go on when she was found, but they would eventually track things down, get a hold of her roommate Teresa, who helped in identifying her and kind of creating the timeline that we have later. As investigators continued to build their case against Richard Cottingham, they brought in some of the women who had been victims of torture and sexual assault that might be connected to their case. One of the first of those known victims was Karen Schultz. On May 22, 1978, a few months after the murder of Mary Ann Carr, Karen was working as a waitress at a bar called Tuesdays in Manhattan. Around 6 p.m. on March 22nd, Karen got off of work and had a couple pina coladas before taking the bus over to Bellevue Hospital, where her husband was a patient after suffering a broken leg. She stayed and visited with him for about an hour and then returned to Tuesdays, where she filled in a partial shift for a coworker. After finishing that shift, she left and started for home, but she was feeling upset after her visit with her husband. They were in the process of divorcing, and when she'd been to visit, the mother of a past girlfriend had come and had been trying to patch up his relationship with her daughter. That was a bit of a mess, so Karen decided to stop at a bar on the way home for a drink to help calm her. While she was sitting at the bar enjoying her drink, she was joined by a man that she would later describe as being about 5'10", around 170 pounds, clean-shaven, and nicely dressed in an open collar shirt and sports jacket. He started to engage in conversation with her, and she politely made some small talk with him before taking her drink from the bar to a table to be alone again. After a few minutes, the man joined her at the table. They talked a little more. Karen confided in him that she was getting a divorce from her husband, she'd been seeing another man, and she was pregnant. The man went to the bar and came back with 2 drinks. Karen would later testify that she had not been watching him at the bar while he had gotten them. After sipping some of the drink he had brought her, Karen started to feel off, like she needed to lay down. She thanked the man for her drink, and she left the bar, starting down 3rd Avenue towards her apartment. She wasn't able to make it very far. She was having a hard time walking. She was stumbling around. And a few moments later, a blue and silver car pulled up to the curb, and the man inside offered her a ride. She accepted, though she would say later this is not something she would have normally done, but she felt unsafe walking with the way she felt. She lost consciousness in the car, waking up at one point and seeing the road signs for Interstate 80 in New Jersey. During the ride, the man would force her to take a red and blue capsule that he called Tylenol, and she would pass out again. She would wake up again to find that the car was now parked in a dark area. She was incapacitated from a combination of being drugged and the alcohol, and she was not able to fight him. She would later recall feeling a burning sensation in one of her breasts and later being thrown from the car. She was found around 9 a.m. the following morning by Little Ferry police in a drainage ditch behind a car at Ledgewood Terrace apartment complex, the same apartment complex that Cottingham had lived with his family until 1975 and where Marianne Carr had been abducted from a few months earlier. Karen's shirt was pulled up, exposing her chest, and police noted that one of her breasts had been burned with a cigarette and brutally bitten. Her pants were undone and pulled around her ankles. Her coat, scarf, purse, and a ring were all missing. She was treated for her injuries at Hackensack Hospital. Blood tests would confirm that she had been drugged with a combination of secobarbital and amobarbital, which combined in a capsule is called Tylenol. On September 10th, 1978, Susan Geiger, a pregnant blonde sex worker, would have her first encounter with Richard Cottingham. She was walking from an apartment of a regular client at the corner of 47th Street and Broadway when a man in a blue 1973 Ford Thunderbird honked and waved her over to him. The man asked if she was a working girl, which she told him that she was. She would recall that the man flashed a huge pile of cash at her, but she was tired and she told him to call her the next day, gave him her number where she was staying with her boyfriend and pimp at the Alpine Hotel. The man did call her the following day and they set up a time to meet at the Burger King near the hotel she was living in. The man called himself Jim, and she described him as having sandy hair, weighing about 175 pounds, wearing wire-rimmed glasses over his blue eyes. He was nicely dressed in a beige sports coat, white shirt, and black pants. He promised her $200 for some drinks and sex. While Susan would later say she didn't usually get in the car with anyone, she trusted the nicely dressed man, and she agreed to ride over to First Avenue to Flanagan's bar. Once there, the man asked her to get some cigarettes while he got them some drinks. She told him that she hadn't been drinking due to being pregnant, but he asked her to please share one drink, and she accepted because she needed the money. When she got back to the table with the cigarettes, she noticed that the man had brought her a vodka and orange juice, and he was stirring it for her with the straw, which he continued to do as they sat and talked. He told her that he was married, had 5 kids, he worked with computers, lived in New Jersey, and he wanted to get a divorce from his wife. Susan started to feel drowsy. The man, calling himself Jim, told her it was probably due to her pregnancy, and she said he offered to pay her for the time that they had spent together and would take her back to the Alpine Hotel. She declined because she really needed the money and wanted to finish her job. So she suggested that they go to the Remington Hotel. As they headed to his car, the man had to nearly carry her due to her level of drowsiness. She would recall feeling extremely out of it and not sure where they were going as he drove, but would recall going over a bridge at some point. She would later also recall waking up and realizing they were in a hotel room where he beat her, bit her, sexually assaulted, and sodomized her. She tried to fight him to protect herself and her baby, but she would end up falling unconscious again, later waking up on the floor of room 28 at the airport hotel, bruised and bloody. Her purse and jewelry were gone. She would be taken to Hackensack Hospital for treatment of her injuries. Blood tests would confirm that she had also been given a combination of secobarbital and amobarbital. She did attempt to pick out the man who had assaulted her from mugshots after leaving the hospital, but was only able to find one that vaguely resembled him. A few days later, after recovering while leaving her hotel, she would see the man again who approached her. However, some other random men in the area noticed how distressed she got when he approached her, and they intervened and he hurried away. On May 12, 1980, 10 days before the assault on Leslie Odell that would lead to Cottingham's arrest, a sex worker named Pamela Weisenfeld was found dumped in a vacant lot in Teaneck, New Jersey. She had also been drugged, beaten, raped, and her breasts had been severely bitten. She would also later identify Richard Cottingham as her attacker. What investigators didn't know when they found her was that her attack was part of the spree that Cottingham was on as he bounced between attacking women in New York and New Jersey. They would find this out in the days after news broke of his arrest, when members of New York's Times Square task force reached out to Bergen County because they had a couple cases that might match Cottingham's modus operandi. But that we're going to save for part 2. Wow, guys. As I said, this is a dark one, truly living up to the name of the podcast. I mentioned at the start I had to walk away from this one while researching it quite a few times and just take a break from true crime in general, because this one is just pure evil. And it's only going to get darker as we dive into part 2 and 3, which will be released over the next 2 weeks. Before I jump to updates regarding the show, I want to share some information and resources that are available for some of the topics we've discussed today. According to the Polaris Project, in 2021, 10,359 situations of human trafficking were reported to the United States National Human Trafficking Hotline, involving 16,554 individual victims. Reports of human trafficking are very likely underreported, so this is only a fraction of the picture. The Polaris Project operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline in the United States. If you or someone you know needs help, you can call 1-888-373-7888 or text BEFREE, that's BEFREE, to the number 233-733. You can go to polarisproject.org for more information, resources, and statistics regarding human trafficking and the work that the Polaris Project is doing in trying to prevent and help survivors. The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN, is another resource that I wanted to share. They are the nation's largest anti-sexual violence resource and run the National Sexual Assault Hotline. If you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, you can call 1-800-656-4273 for help and support, or you can download their mobile app or visit www.rainn.org. I'm excited to announce that I have teamed up with the Polaris Project to help raise funds to support their work, the prevention and advocacy to end human trafficking. Linked in the show notes, you'll find the URL to the fundraising page if you are interested in donating to their cause. So please consider making a donation if you're able. Any amount helps. If you can't donate, that's okay too. You can help by taking a moment to share the campaign to help spread awareness and help us with our goal in that way. And finally, to close us out, I just wanted to give a quick couple updates on the show in general. I mentioned at the beginning that even though I haven't released episodes in the last several weeks, I have been working on them in the background and have several episodes that are already done and ready to go to help ensure that I can continue to release episodes weekly as I have always intended to do. In the past, life has had a tendency to get away from me sometimes, so I've had to scramble some weeks to get content out at the last minute. This should hopefully not be the case going forward. I think my upcoming schedule has a variety of content that has good balance between true crime elements as well as history around New York and some other exciting things that I've had on the radar. I've also got a special guest host coming in a few weeks, so I'm excited to bring her on and hope to have her popping into the show for guest host appearances every now and again in the future. One other thing that I have been working on is building the show's Patreon page. Right now I have 2 tiers and I'm planning on adding a third. The first tier, for $2 a month, you'll get a shout out in an upcoming episode, my eternal gratitude, and sneak peeks of the upcoming episode topics. For $5 a month, you'll get the benefits of the $2 tier and early access to the next week's episode. The proceeds from the show will go back to the show and help support the cost of equipment, programs, and research materials to keep the show running. And a portion of the proceeds will also go towards our fundraising campaign with the Polaris Project. I think that about covers the business side of things for now. I'm excited to be back in action and just want to thank you for your patience while I've dealt with life. Just one more quick reminder, if you haven't already done so, please make sure you're following the show on your podcast platform of choice for updates on when new episodes launch. I'd also greatly appreciate it if you can consider giving the show a rating or a share so that our dark side community can continue to grow. I hope you all have a great week ahead, and I'll be back next week with the second installment of my coverage of New York's torso killer Richard Cottingham. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you stay curious.